drastic steps for them. And especially if our old age people, they have comorbidities, then it becomes a real risk for them. If you look at the ministry's data, 70% of the mortality, they are happening in comorbid situation. And what are the most common risk factors? Hypertension, cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, diabetes. So, and these diseases are very common in our country. Means 30% population, one third of our population is our hypertensive, 1/10% they are diabetic. So I expect this is the group with comorbid condition which is going to see the major setback in terms cases as well as mortality. Here I would like to emphasize one more thing. If you look at the demography of our country, that in our country, the chances of having hypertension, cardiovascular disease or diabetes is 10 years earlier than the Western world. So whatever diseases which we see in plus 60 age group, in our country, we would see them in 50 to 60-year age group also. So whatever the recommendation which we give for plus 60-year age group, I would say that we should recommend to our plus 50-year age group. That is important because comorbid conditions are more than them. That is the second challenge. And third challenge in our area. Some of the research groups, they have discussed that many socioeconomic factors like low income, education level, certain demographic factors like population density, urbanization, health and hygiene factors like practice of hand washing, toilet facilities, temperature, relative humidity. These are also the confounders for making it conclusive whether a particular state would have more cases or not. As per these 15 indicators which a global research has computed, they have predicted that Bihar, Jharkhand, West Bengal, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, and some adjoining area of Rajasthan and Maharashtra, they are going to be very vulnerable for COVID-19 cases. So we need to be careful about this region. Fortunately, Uttarakhand has low vulnerability for COVID, and it is true also we have not yet completed our sanctuary. So we are in a better situation, but definitely we should be watchful because migration is happening in our state also, and chances of increasing infections are there. So these are the few negative factors. And if I talk about the future trend of cases, one professor, Dr. Jay Prakash Mulyal, he is a chairperson Scientific Advisory Committee of National Institute of Epidemiology. He has predicted that in urban area, mortality in next coming year could be 4.5 lakh to 8.5 lakh. And in rural area, it could go up to 11 lakh. I know these are huge numbers and these numbers can scare anybody, but this is what has been predicted as per the mathematical model. But I'm sure with all the measures which our country and communities are taking, definitely we can lower these figures. But UNICEF has also predicted that death of additional 1.2 to 6 lakh children can happen because of preventable causes as a consequence of disruption in the regular services. So the main theme which comes out of the whole discussion is that if we want to have a bright future, we should look upon or we should emphasize or establish the primary health services again. We need to emphasize on strengthening the present health system. Then only we can tackle this situation positively. The other point which is important for tackling is that we should implement our routine immunization. We all know if you don't give measles vaccine, automatically immunity is lesser. If you don't give vitamin A, the baby can die of other infections. So it is important that routine immunization services are implemented, emphasized. We should also focus on our national non-communicable disease program, because these are the program in which we implement regular checking of blood pressure and monitoring of your blood sugar level, also cancer screening in there, which are the comorbidities causing more mortality. So these programs must be emphasized. And one important public health measure which I would like to strongly emphasize is reducing overcrowding. When I say overcrowding, maybe it is there in the orphanages or health center or schools. And shortly, when we will open our school in month of July or August, definitely we have to see that how we can reduce overcrowding in these schools. We would require more classrooms. We will require more teachers in the classes to manage those children. So these are going to be upcoming challenges. But if we are well prepared to meet out these challenges, definitely we have a bright future ahead. So these are the things from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Saxena, for an excellent talk, giving us a wide variety of understanding of the epidemiology of the disease. Thankful for your excellent talk. We'll keep all the questions for the last. And so the questions are coming in one by one, and then we'll ask the questions to all of you one by one. So we did quite a bit. We are almost nearing 70 participants now in this webinar. And we talked about the basic virology. Dr. Gupta gave a fantastic talk on the virology, the biological aspects, the origin of the virus. And then we had Dr. Kalita giving an excellent talk on the different strains of the virus, what that means. And then we had, so we're going to continue this very interesting discussion. Meanwhile, I'm getting a lot of interesting questions. We'll tackle the questions one by one. I now called Professor Shailendra Handu, who is the professor and head of pharmacology at AIIMS Rishikesh. He'll give us an idea about the only drug which sort of seems to be only antiviral drug that seems to be working for COVID-19. So we'll get to know more about remdesivir. Dr. Handu, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Indranil. A good day to our Professor Ravikant, Honorable Director, and all the participants. I'm supposed to talk about remdesivir. The scenario currently is reminiscent of the 80s when the HIV pandemic emerged, although it progressed at a slower pace. But at that time also, the investigators and researchers scrambled to find a drug once the HIV was detected, to identify a drug which will be effective against the retrovirus. So what they ultimately found was Iluvidine, which was lying on the shelf of Wellcome Burroughs for almost 2 decades. So we are in a similar situation, although in a fast-forward mode. And we all know that drug development is a tedious and tortuous route. And the discovery of a single drug can take anywhere between 5 to 10 years. So we don't have that window of time available with us. So the options with us are repurposing the already existing drugs, so which are already in therapeutics. So can any one of these drugs work? So that's why we looked at hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine. We have the option of lopinavir, ritonavir. We have the option of umifenovir, and so on. The other option is to look at the investigational drugs which are in various phases of clinical trials. And therein we have a very strong candidate in the form of remdesivir and also another compound, favipiravir. So these are the 2 potential candidates which could be effective, and we are getting positive signals from whatever data we are generating from the trials. Primarily, when you develop an antiviral drug for any virus, we primarily target 3 or 4 aspects of the biology of that virus. So primarily, we either target the entry of the virus into the host cell, We target its machinery for protein synthesis. Both structural and non-structural proteins are vital for survival of a replication of a virus. And finally, the replication of the genome, which is vital for replication. So these, and finally, for some viruses, we can target their release, like, for example, H1N1. We can prevent their release even once they are replicated inside the host cell. So these are the potential targets. And the focus is on remdesivir, and there are positive signals. So I'll focus on remdesivir. This is a nucleotide protein which gets converted in the body into an active metabolite, and its mechanism is the inhibition of RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. So the vital enzyme, RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, is vital for the replicative process of this virus. So it strongly inhibits this enzyme in vitro, and
Dr. Shailendra, you have muted yourself. Can you open your mute? Yeah, okay now. Go ahead.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it's okay now. It's okay. Go ahead. Please.
So what is the status of remdesivir? So it was already undergoing phase 2 trials. This is a molecule developed by Gilead Sciences, and it was already under development. And it was tested for MERS, it was tested for SARS-1, it was tested for other viruses, and it's quite potent when you see the data from in vitro studies or animal studies. So it is a prospective, strong candidate. So we have data from some trials. Some are ongoing, but some trials have been completed, and we have the interim data from some of the trials. So I'll share with you the data from some of the trials. The very first trial with remdesivir was carried out by Wong and et al. In Wuhan. So that was the first site where because that was where it all started. And it was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, multicentric trial carried out on 237 patients. So it was a placebo-controlled, multicentric trial, but the results were not that favorable. So what they concluded is that in terms of clinical recovery, there was not much of a difference between remdesivir and the placebo group. But the only positive from this trial was that if you patients early, as is true for other types of influenza, if you start early, you can derive benefit from this drug. So their study concluded that if you treat with remdesivir within first 10 days of development of symptoms, then chances of clinical recovery are faster. So that was the conclusion of this study from Wuhan. And then there were some anecdotal studies, where in US this drug was administered on compassionate basis, and they also showed some positive recoveries in some patients. And finally, the National Institute of Health took over, and they have an ongoing trial, which is the adaptive COVID treatment trial going on, and the drug monitoring and safety committee has carried out an interim analysis, and the analysis has shown some favorable results. The result is, these are just interim results, preliminary results. They show a 31% faster time to recovery for those on remdesivir compared to those on placebo. And also there is a mortality or survival benefit also. In the remdesivir group, the mortality rate was 8% versus 11.6% for the placebo group. So these are positive indications from the NIH clinical trial. Then we have, of course, we'll wait for the final results from this trial. Then we have the sponsored trials which are being conducted by Gilead, and the acronyms are SIMPLE-1 and SIMPLE-2 trials. The SIMPLE-1 trial, these are unpublished data which they have announced just 1 week back, where they compared a 5-day treatment with a 10-day treatment, and they found that the 5-day treatment is as effective as 10-day treatment, and almost 60% of patients recovered and they were discharged from the hospital and on day 14. So that is another positive, that you don't need to treat for 10 days. You can just treat for 5 days. The urgency for reducing the duration of treatment is also because of the availability of the drug. The FDA on 1st of May has permitted the emergency use of the drug, and so the drug is being distributed across United States in various hospitals, but it all will depend on the supply and demand equation. So that is another positive, that we can treat patients with 5 days regimen, and the recovery rates are equal. And then Gilead is also conducting a SIMPLE-2 trial, where they are administering the drug intravenously. That's a bigger trial, which will involve around 5,000 patients. I think, in fact, this trial also, the 5-day versus 10-day trial, they are extending to almost 6,000 patients in the second phase. Similarly, the SIMPLE-2 trial will be studying the effect of remdesivir versus standard of care in around 1,000 patients. So the results of that trial are expected by the end of May. So these are the data which are currently available. In addition, we have the WHO sponsored trial, where their 4 modalities are being compared. And there you have one arm of remdesivir, then you have lopinavir and ritonavir, and then there is another arm of interferon beta 1A alpha and chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. So the results from these trials are expected in the coming weeks and months. So as of now, remdesivir seems to be the best bet. The dosage for remdesivir is simple: 200 milligrams loading dose on the first day, followed by 100 milligrams over the next 5 or 10 days. Adverse effect profile, they have also looked at the safety aspects of remdesivir, and they have found a few adverse effects. There is some rise in liver enzymes. Many patients complain of nausea, and there are few patients who go on to respiratory failure. In most of these trials, the primary endpoint was a 7-point score, and the endpoint was a 2-point reduction in the severity score from discharge to death. So that was the primary endpoint, and then of course the mortality. This was the design followed by these trials, and then lastly, the adverse effects. Okay, I was talking about the adverse effects profile. So some patients did worsen with treatment, but overall the efficacy was much improved compared to placebo in all the three trials. The patients that were taken up for these trials were the admitted moderately severe cases, those who had oxygen saturation of 92 or less, 94 or less, and those who had indications of pneumonia. But these trials did not take up patients who were on ventilator. So those were excluded from the trial. So these are the data I'm sharing with you regarding remdesivir, and we have to wait for more data emerging from these trials. With that, I will conclude and pass. And back to Dr. Indrani.
Thank you very much, Dr. Handu, for an excellent exposition of the only drug that we have till today that seems to be acting on and brings down the seriousness of the disease in COVID-19. So we have, from the morning, we had a bunch of good talks. So we had, for those who joined late, just an update, we had Professor Ravikant giving an excellent overview of the administrative problems that a National Institute of Eminence like AIIMS Rishikesh might also face so that they can handle COVID patients. This was followed by two virology session, excellent session, one by Dr. Gupta updating the virus, where did it come from, what it does. And then we had by Dr. Kalita, who talked about the different strain and where we are as far as India is concerned. This was followed by an excellent exposition to the epidemiology of the disease in India with reference to Uttarakhand, but also with reference to other places, other cities, which could be other states, which could be hotspot by Dr. Saxena. And just now we had an excellent exposition of the drug remdesivir, as well as a general pharmacological overview by Dr. Handu. I would now invite one request, please, everybody other than the speakers, please keep yourself mute so that it doesn't disturb the others and there's no sound coming in. Now let's welcome Dr. Panda. Dr. Panda is from internal medicine in AIIMS, and Dr. Panda is going to give us an overview of the clinical symptom diagnosis, what tests to do when you have a patient who you suspect might be having COVID-19. All yours, Dr. Panda, please go ahead. Can you hear me, Dr. Panda? Can you hear me? Hello? Dr. Panda, can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me? We can't hear you. Just please make sure that your mic is proper and you're speaking close to the mic.
Okay, sir. Now it's okay, sir?
Yeah, now it's okay. Please go ahead.
Okay. And you are seeing the sir slides?
Yeah, we are seeing the slides. Yes. You can.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, it's beautifully seen. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good morning to all. I will actually in the next few minutes more focus on a few clinical features and diagnosis part, mainly the overview of how to approach a case and next what investigation we should do, and I will conclude my session. And in the clinical features, till now we know male is actually being affected more than female, averagely 1.5 times than the female, and median age group averagely 71 years. Incubation period is around 4 to 5 days, but by 11 days, 97% are getting symptomatic, And as already previous speaker told, 80% cases only mild flu-like illnesses, and 14% got hospitalization requirement like severe illnesses. And among that, only 5% have critical illnesses. And these data is up to March end. But after March, actually, we are seeing a different type of data. Like among these 35,000, there is an international consortium, and our AIIMS Rishikesh and also few Indian sites are also part of this. In this, we are seeing 90% of the patients with the last 14 days of follow-up data among the 20,000 cases, they are in the ICU, and 30% cases they are dying. It means overall up to 6% cases they are dying. It is internal data. And 80% who are actually non-ICU or who are actually the status we don't know. And among these, 17% are also in hospital. And 25% are also death from that 80% of supposed to be non-ICU cases. So therefore, with time in this, my end, probably we get more clear-cut data whether that severity is only 15% or 5% of critical illnesses, or this 5% will go to up to 10%. Because more diagnoses are going on now, and more cases are getting hospitalization. If you see mild to moderate variety, these are only flu-like illnesses. It's you all know part of H1N1, mainly fever, cough, and myalgia. Few typical features of in this COVID specific, like the loss of smell and loss of taste also. And these are specially reported from the USA and UK data, not in Indian data. And few bleeding manifestations are also there. Mild bleeding manifestations like small punctate hemorrhages or conjunctivitis. These are the rare features which are associated with the COVID, mild symptoms. If you can see these proportion or percentage of symptoms, mainly fever, breathlessness, and cough without, that is the dry cough is the major symptoms, but these are the long list of all symptoms in this 30,000 data of 14 days follow-up. And you can see one part is their alter consciousness or confusion. These are the fifth most common symptoms. So in the worldwide data, this conductor sensorium or as a part of CNS involvement is also taking more safe towards this. Till now, we have only one guideline, that is IDSA, Infectious Disease Society of America, has given a clear-cut symptoms definition or compatible to COVID. They've defined it as a respiratory symptoms alone has to be there, and or at least two of the symptoms like fever, muscle pain, headache, sore throat, or new loss of taste and smell, they have included already here. So therefore, from now onwards, we'll focus on these compatible COVID-19 symptoms, mainly respiratory symptoms, or at least two of these symptoms. And all the risk factors already described by Professor Bartika ma'am. But one point I want to highlight here, COVID is a viral disease, or it is a more of an infection. As an infection specialist, or I will say any infection actually can precipitate or exacerbate any comorbidities. Because all these comorbidities which are listed, they are more common in our society. Therefore, we are telling these comorbidities are getting more exaggerated, but it's not like that. Any comorbidity, if a person is having, that means his or her body immunity is in like a substandard. Therefore, any infection comes to the body, including this virus COVID, automatically the severity will definitely higher. Especially immunocompromised conditions, HIV, and history of smoking is a part of immunocompromised condition. They are listed in that risk factor category. Coming to the severe disease, when we will tell it is a severe disease to any other organ manifestation, since the COVID is a mainly respiratory type of disease from the beginning, when the viremia is there, therefore tachypnea, hypoxia, and lung infiltrate more than 50% within 24 to 48 hours of admission. These are the three major categories of severe disease to define. It is not inclusive. It can other parts, like I told, any organ when it is severely involved, that is a part of category of severe disease, like myocarditis, like nephritis as a kidney involvement, like CNS meningoencephalitis, all are part of severe disease. But the primarily in the viremia phase, respiratory is more involved. When immunological phase comes after 7 days of illness, any organ can be involved. If you see the recover versus death vital signs, the same thing you will see in the consciousness, loss of consciousness or the alter consciousness is around in the death patient around 22% with respect to 1% who are recovered. So therefore, from this, at this point of time, we will think any organ, but first organ will be the respiratory, second will be part of the CNS, and third GI tract and myocardial involvement. If you see few features typical to the neurological manifestation of severity, the corticospinal tract signs are up to 67%, and brain MRI are suggesting also 60% of leptomeningeal enhancement, and perfusion abnormality, if you can go for MRI which suggests perfusion changes, up to 100% cases they have seen actually in the 11 case series data. And the CSF analysis, you will get actually some oligoclonal bands, but that suggests overall it is an immunological phenomenon affecting all the organs, not only respiratory. That perfusion abnormality can be a part of heart also, myocardial, then can part of a kidney also. So therefore, when after 7 days of onset of illness, that is immunological phase starts, then any organ can be involved as a part of immunological manifestation. In the liver, around 30 or 40% cases have some abnormal liver function test, but it is mildly elevated. You can see ALT range of 41 to 150, AST also 37, just 2 to 3 times it is elevated. But few cases, it can have severe hyperbilirubinemia up to actually more than 20. Next comes to the diagnosis part. This is the recent guidelines. It is released on the this first week of May only, and we should remember this nucleic acid test, that is a PCR, that is the gold standard. There is no doubt about that. But how will you approach any symptomatic cases as the symptoms is already defined? If you are suspecting high means the patient is coming from that area and they had a red zone or a hotspot area or any travel history or a contact history is there. Even if you are non-hospitalized or hospitalized, you have to go for the testing. In the suspicion category, or when it is low, you will go for the testing. But if one's first report is negative, there is no requirement of repeat testing. In these guidelines, they emphasize about the negative part, not the positive part. Because if first negative of a high suspected cases, then repeat test has to be there. That we have to remember in our daily practices. Negative test does not rule out the COVID. Therefore, even if BMJ recently, just 2 days before, BMJ has given a guidance on this, actually, positivity is well. We understand it is highly 100% specificity, but negativity does not rule out the disease because it depends upon the type of specimen. In asymptomatic cases also, few things we have to remember, like immunosuppressive cases undergoing any procedure, and major time sensitive surgery, if surgery taking more time, and any time sensitive aerosol general procedure, all we should go for testing. They are advising this is the special category where asymptomatic cases, because in our area, asymptomatic cases will be much more. And if you see this beautiful slide, actually sensitivity, specificity of all the samples like nasopharyngeal, nasal, oral, or mid-terminate, you can see mid-terminate has 100% averagely up to a median of 100% sensitivity. So therefore, we should plan for this mid-terminate, how to collect this sample. Our ENT people will actually develop this methodology so that we'll get more sensitivity cases, so that our negativity actually decreases, so that repeat test also decreases. And upper respiratory tract samples and lower respiratory tract samples also, they have clearly said that if you are first, you should go for upper respiratory sample. If it is negative and suspicion high, and the case is a lower respiratory tract disease, then go for the LRTI sample, especially sputum. If it is not developing, then induced sputum. Then otherwise it is a ball or tracheal aspirate. That we are doing all the critical cases who are ventilated, we are going for tracheal aspirate, but they emphasize if first URI sample is negative, then go for the LRT samples. few new technology as a part apart from the real-time PCR. There is another rapid RNA testing is already available at the lab methods, and another actually that is a part of Indian the CC3 Institute actually developed this, and the NIB Pune has also analyzed 100% accuracy for that, and it is a rapid test of within 2 hours. Probably in the next few days we will get this, and will not much depend on the RT-PCR at the first screening point. What we get in the laboratory actually after confirmation, even if during the suspense state, we are testing some CBC, LFT, KFT routine investigation. In that, we are getting lymphopenia is a major feature up to 90% cases, less than 1500, and elevated all the organ involvement as a part of like mild transaminases, mild LDH elevation, or elevated inflammatory markers, ferritin, procalcitonin, CRP, ESR. You will get actually as a part of organ involvement. As I told, in the viremia phase, automatically the respiratory is the major dominant. Once viremia ends, or in the overlap viremia plus immunological phase, any organ can be involved, and that point of time, any organ dysfunction will be there and laboratory will be there. We'll few words about the imaging actually points in the COVID. Fickner Society already given a guidelines that there is no indication for any imaging if it is a mild clinical features unless there is a risk of disease progression. That is not clearly defined actually risk of disease progression. Already medical society is already in the planning of that prognostic scores and how to develop a risk scores. We are on that. Probably in the next few days we will get that. But if you are suspecting yours every day saturation is deteriorating or hypoxia generating tachycardia and also tachypnea is getting, then probably patient is got the risk of progression. Therefore, you need that point of time actually in imaging. X-ray or CT scan depend upon the fast availability. And X-ray 80% cases have some findings. Major finding is actually consolidation, and that consolidation is peripheral distribution, lower gene dominant, and bilateral involvement. These are the averagely 50% cases. These three classical findings in the X-ray: peripheral, lower zone, and bilateral. If you compare to the CT scan, also they have a highest discriminatory value: peripheral distribution, ground glass opacity, and bronchovascular thickening. These are the three important points for the CT scan to remember as a high discriminatory value towards COVID suspected. If you see this image of CT scan, they have categorized 4 stages in the CT scan finding. Usually first day they may have some only ground glass opacity, that is picture A, and in the next 5 days like day 5 to day 10, in the mid time day 7 they get some crazy paving pattern along with the ground glass opacity pattern, and the third you will get clear cut consolidation in the third 5th day, and after 5th day, 15 days of illness, you may get some resolution, that is a residual findings or fibrosis part. And the same thing actually, the clear-cut picture of ground glass opacity, and this is typically crazy paving pattern, and this is typically consolidation. And I conclude my session with one word to all of you and also me himself, that Yakta Krishna Karmakit means we have to united for the whole spectrum, starting from the epidemiology till the outcome prognosis part or the so public health to take care in a united way so that we can fight this COVID. Thank you, sir.
Of COVID-19. I now request Dr. Bhanu Duggal to talk about the cardiovascular effects of COVID. As you know, COVID, unfortunately, a lot of people who have terminal disease and who die have severe cardiovascular involvement, part of the cytokine release syndrome. So, Dr. Duggal, to you, please.
Good morning. Can you see the screen, Indranim?
Yeah, I can. There's nothing in the screen. Are you on? No, I'm
Video.
yeah, I can see it. Yeah, you can be seen now. Go ahead. Yes, you're perfect.
You can see my screen now?
Yeah, I can see your screen. Yeah. Dr. Panda, can you mute yourself, please?
Yes, sir, I did.
Good morning, everyone, respected director, sir, and my colleagues. And I thank Israel for organizing this lovely symposium.
Dr. Panda, you are still on. Can you please mute your screen? Mute your ear, please.
My topic is cardiovascular manifestations in COVID.
Something else. There's not an echo, Dr. Bhanu.
Yeah,
Is there any other device near you?
is your phone or something on?
I'm just trying to, I'll just close all
Go ahead. No worries. Go ahead. Just go ahead. There is a lot of. Yeah, that's better now.
That's better?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah, it's coming back again. Do you have anything electronic like a phone? Yeah, that's gone. That's better.
Okay. So we all know that there are three phases of the disease. Stage 1, the asymptomatic phase, the stage 2, pulmonary phase, and stage 3, covered by Dr. Panda. And coming to the cardiac manifestations, there can be, the COVID virus can cause direct myocardial injury by attaching itself to the myocytes through the ACE2 receptors. The other two mechanisms are damage caused by hypoxemia in patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome, and the third manifestation can be due to the hyperinflammatory response caused by the cytokine storm. This is the
Sorry for the interruption. Are you, do you have two devices open? Because this looks like it is electronic interference from another device. Like two computers or one computer and a laptop or one phone.
switched off everything.
No, it is someone else computer which is making. Now better, now better.
Yeah, it's better now. Please go ahead. Dr. Panda, please mute yourself, sir.
There are many others whose computer is on, the mic is on, they should mute the mic.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Duggal. Please go ahead.
Okay. So, presentation can be predominantly of two types. Clerkin et al. In Circulation have said that a patient can purely with a cardiac disorder nearly 4 days after the onset of symptoms. That is called early myocarditis. This is caused by the virus attaching to the myocytes directly through the ACE2 receptors. In this, the patient can present with acute coronary ACS, acute coronary syndrome, stress, cardiomyopathy, or with various arrhythmias. This is an early phase of myocarditis caused by direct damage to the myocytes by the virus, and this is can occur in 7 to 10% of the patients. Late myocarditis can occur when it is associated with the as a sequelae to the acute respiratory distress syndrome, cytokine storm, and hypoxemic damage. So case 1 is a 64-year-old woman who came with chest pain for 2 days and cardiogenic shock. Her ECG showed ST elevation in lead 1 and AVL and V2 to V6. She was treated as an acute myocardial infarction with cardiogenic shock. Coronary angiogram was done, which was completely normal. She had no history of fever, cough, or travel. The troponins were high. Echo showed concentric left ventricular hypertrophy, but the ejection fraction was 30%. In the cath lab, because of her low blood pressure, intra-aortic balloon pump was good, and her test of SARS-CoV-2 came as positive. She was treated with hydroxychloroquine high dose, and gradually the IABP was weaned off. So this patient had no evidence respiratory symptoms at all.
The second case is a similar case taken from Twitter, which has a number of cases because obviously publications take longer, so Twitter has a better set of ECGs for us. This patient has again ST elevation in the inferior lead, suggestive of an RC or a left circumflex block. However, again, you can see that the coronaries were normal, and this was again diagnosed and treated as COVID myocarditis. Third was a case of stress cardiomyopathy, Takotsubo's disease. Patient again came with chest pain, had normal coronaries, but the ejection fraction was 32%, dilated left ventricle. Here, what you see is that the apex, you can see this dark contrast folding. So here in the apex and the anterior wall are akinetic. There's another Takotsubo which is called reverse Takotsubo, seen basically in this disease, in which if the MRI is done, the disease is seen in the basal septum and the posterior wall. Anterior, the apex and the distal IVS is paired. So these are the coronaries you can see beautifully are completely normal. Pathology, the lymphocytic infiltration is seen in the myocardium. So these are the cases who came directly as a cardiac manifestation with no respiratory symptoms, and they were treated with steroids and IV immunoglobulin for viral myocarditis. Though no recommendations are there, these cases are individual case reports. Along with that, they were given antiviral therapy. The last case also was put on ECMO, and after 15 days of antivirals and IVIG, she recovered. So the range of clinical manifestations, cardiac manifestations, ranges from asymptomatic biomarker elevation to acute coronary syndrome as discussed, arrhythmias, cardiomyopathy, heart failure, myocarditis, pericarditis, fulminant myocarditis with cardiogenic shock. The asymptomatic biomarker elevation, nearly 40% of the patients or nearly 50% in the ICU patients have elevated troponin and BNP, indicating myocardial damage. And these are the patients who do poorly. Looking at these graphs, if you see, the cardiac troponin in panel, the cardiac troponin is highly elevated in the non-survivors, but the levels are minimally elevated in the survival group. So this is a comparison of survivors versus non-survivors. The troponins are elevated, the C-reactive protein is high, the interleukins are high, the serum ferritin, so all inflammatory and evidence of myocardial damage is there. The higher it is much higher in the non-survivors. In panel C, if we see, the troponin level is nearly 200 and more than 250 or 260 times the level seen in the survivors. So, however, routine use of these tests is controversial. Many times we get a call that patient is having some non-classical cardiac findings, but troponins are elevated. However, troponin can be just be a marker of poor prognosis without cardiac involvement. So there are two schools of thought. One is that the ACC says that you use troponin and BNP for diagnosis of an acute MI only if there's a clinical picture of chest pain, classical ECG changes, echo changes. Then you do isolated troponins and BNPs should not be taken. Another school of thought thinks that these can be used as a prognostic marker. So congestive heart failure is can be seen in nearly 23% of the patients and 52% of the CCU patients, and these patients do poorly. There can be two kinds of heart failure. Heart failure with preserved ejection fraction has been reported more commonly. Heart failure with poor ejection fraction has also been reported. Another clinical finding being seen is pulmonary embolism. So patients have been found to have a prothrombotic state, especially if the D-dimer levels are 6 times the normal. A large thrombus is seen here in the pulmonary artery, a saddle-shaped thrombus. Here the troponins are elevated and there's some discussion of giving anticoagulants in patients with a prothrombotic state. Coming to ECG and arrhythmia, so ECG, many times we want to avoid exposure to aerosols. And we keep the patient prone. So a prone ECG can be taken. Only thing we have to get used to this ECG. The leads are placed as you can see from V1 to V6 in a prone patient. Please do not deprone him and get exposed. So what is because of ICU transfer in our injury were more likely to have baseline comorbidities.
Dr. Dugal, can you hear me?
And
Dr.
CAD.
Dugal, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can't see you. It's too much noise. Nobody can hear you. So I think why don't we, something is going on. No worries. See if you can shorten the talk slightly. Because
Yeah,
nobody can hear you.
Increased mortality is seen in patients with cardiac injury. So there are two factors which determine cardiac injury: acute respiratory distress syndrome and cardiac injury. Coming to ST elevation MI management, this is my last slide, but the most important slide. The patients of STEMI who are coming to the emergency, the patients who are once we have excluded COVID, they will go along the pathway on the right. We exclude COVID infection. If the onset time is less than 12 hours, patient has no contraindications to thrombolysis, then nowadays thrombolytic therapy is advised. And if he responds and there is no risk, he can be discharged. However, if he continues to have symptoms and arrhythmia, he will be taken up for emergency PCI in an isolated catheter room. So in this, what Professor Ravikant had mentioned is that this PCI there should be an isolated cath lab with negative pressure room where where all these cases should be done unless the COVID has come negative. Some people say once, others have advised twice also. So PCI should be done in a negative pressure cath lab, and then you continue to treat in the CCU. The second is if COVID infection is, if it's a suspected or a confirmed case of COVID, then if the vital signs are stable again and he has come in less than 12 hours, he will undergo thrombolysis and not primary angioplasty. Primary angioplasty is done if the patient is hemodynamically unstable and has come outside the window period of thrombolysis. In all these suspected cases, full PPE should be worn. PPE level 3 is recommended, and PCI should be again done in an isolated catheter room with negative pressure ventilation. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Dugal, for the excellent talk. For some reason, we have been having electronic disturbances. Some of the talk was not very well heard. My apologies for that. Sometimes you have electronic distraction that might be causing this. But an excellent talk on the cardiovascular effects. So now I have a lot of questions, and I think I'll try to cover a couple of topics that was not brought up. The good news is that we had an extensive coverage of entire COVID spectrum, starting from the virology, the epidemiology, the pharmacology of the most important drug that seems to be working on COVID. Then we went to the clinical features, how to define mild, moderate, and severe patients. And then we talked about the cardiovascular effects of COVID. So it was an extensive coverage, and thank you all the speakers for everything. But stay afloat, because we have a bunch of questions that I'm going to ask each of you, because a lot of people who have been, we had over 75 people, faculties here, plus there was a bunch in the Facebook, listening to Facebook Live. So the couple of highlights that I wanted to give is, number one, on the drugs. The other drug that has been tried is a small study, 129 people, on tocilizumab, which is basically a IL-6 inhibitor. As you guys know, the pathology of COVID disease is that COVID actually doesn't kill. It is the body's reaction to COVID. You have something called the cytokine release syndrome. The cytokine release syndrome releases a bunch of cytokines, including IL-6. So IL-6 inhibitors have shown some promises in a trial of 129 patients here in the US. There are other also like sarilumab, that's also IL-6 inhibitor. But the question is, we just don't know when we should be using IL-6. And the reason is this, because remember, IL-6 is part of the body's response to COVID. When in the response become too much and there is the cytokine release syndrome, that's where it kills, because there is multi-organ damage, the lungs are flooded with inflammation, there's severe myocarditis. Now, as Dr. Duggal pointed out, there is myocarditis, but till now, in SARS-1 and in MERS, they did find virus in the myocardium, but till now, though not many were done, there's no evidence that the virus is actually found in the myocardium, though we know very well that both the heart as well as the vascular system has ACE2 receptors. So it could be the myocarditis could be induced by cytokines themselves rather than physically by the virus. About the thrombosis, also there's large vessel thrombosis, which is rare in any other disease, and people have had stroke from massive middle cerebral artery, anterior cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery thrombosis. And again,